When I first heard about the movie Midway, I had no big expectations. The trailer showed CGI, a Jonas brother, and most of all it was directed by Roland Emmerich, the man responsible for this.
I was wondering if you wanted to get a drink, maybe fall in love.
For this.
Good. That's good. That's what you always wanted.
And some other movies as cheesy and silly as you can get. I wasn't convinced, okay? And what a surprise, it didn't receive good ratings from the critics. A lot of them said it was boring, disjointed, with no character development, and some even called it a massive failure. And with Emmerich's name on it, I expected something as historically inaccurate and cheesy as Michael Bay's romance movie. So I never went to watch it. Then by chance I saw a video on it by Story Buffs, a very good channel that talks about historical films. And I clicked, thinking, oh, can't wait to see him destroy that garbage. And then this happened.
A movie so accurate that I struggled to find anything significantly wrong with it, and believe me, I tried. But the type of movie where history is used as a blueprint to tell a story, not a guideline. These are the types of films that history buffs love to watch.
Okay.
Let's just say that was unexpected. And furthermore, despite some of the Hollywood aspects, this is still the most realistic movie about naval combat ever made, said retired Navy Rear Admiral Sam Cox, the NHAC director who personally supported each phase of the historical review. It does real credit to the courage and sacrifice of those who fought in the battle on both sides. So, being a big historian myself, I had to see it.
But something happened then.
I
did not intend.
Well, I actually liked it. To be honest, I've seen tons of war movies, of course, the big classics, and even obscure Italian ones from the 1960s. And I didn't find Midway bad. It hurts to say it, but I didn't. So I went to read the critics to see what they had to say, and it's controversial. There were a lot of negative ones. Midway sings like a depth charge. Every tired war movie cliche is unhearted in a film that brings nothing new but will no doubt please fans of men in uniform yelling at explosions. And then they complain about cliche one-liners in the movie. Like watching a statue for 2.5 hours, there's nothing to do but sit back and yawn. Big journalism. Dick Best is a name few screenwriters would have the balls to invent. Oh, and look at this one. He's a former Marine that writes reviews now, and we can really feel his subtlety.
Use the 2 hours 18 minutes to instead do something more enjoyable, like repeatedly smashing your face into a wall. The dialogue. What's the worst written movie you've ever witnessed? Multiply that by 200. A chimpanzee learning American Sign Language could have concocted a better script. From a professional film critic.
Funnily enough, you have people wrestling in the comments about this too. Here, a former USAF officer and pilot says Midway did a good job and should be appreciated. A guy under that complains that pilots were flying with canopies open, despite it really being the case at the time, because canopies would fog up during dives if left closed, as this happened at Coral Sea. And now, Rotten Tomatoes. You know what? Let's leave it for the end. YouTube reviewers were honestly much more balanced.
If you like history, then you're invested into the story because of that. If you're not interested in history and you don't like war movies, then there's no giant overarching character story that's going to save this movie for you.
That final verdict, it's probably a 6 out of 10. It's a slightly above average film.
Yeah, overall I would say it's a big list of historical pluses.
Nice little library. Let's flex our libraries, bro.
That's in the books. Read on.
Sorry about that.
But overall, like I said, my main takeaway is it almost looks like it's a film that you or I would make as history nerds.
So with the divergent critics, it's easy to see there's a battle here. Now, before diving in, it's worth mentioning that Emmerich directed the movie, but that the man who wrote it was Wes Took. He's a big story fan, especially of the Pacific Theater, and wrote his first big feature here. And it all really transpired in the movie.
Historical accuracy.
So for a film openly committed to historical accuracy, this should be the first point to look at. The movie features events and details that we knew and are always glad to see on screen. I could make a separate video on this, but I'll just name a few. Well, first of all, the buildings at Pearl Harbor. I'll come back to the CG later, but they could render the exact buildings of the time. You also have the defective torpedoes, because it took a while for them to become efficient on the US side and to be acknowledged by its makers. Fighter planes coming out of the sun, that was a common tactic. And while I'm talking about planes, showing the fact that pilots had to read maps often added to immersion. During the Marshall Island raids, the Japanese sent bombers to retaliate, and the American anti-air gunners were really that bad at the time.
Goddamn gunners, don't they know they gotta lead those planes?
Bruno Gaido shooting down a bomber, it really happened like that? Of course, we love to see again the contribution of Layton and Rochefort in deciphering the Japanese messages and permitting the victory at Midway. Because immediately after the battle, Commander John Redmond, who led the rival cryptanalysis team and who despised Rochefort and disagreed with him, took the merit, and Rochefort only received recognition later on. Another important detail shown was the Japanese inter-service dispute between the Army and the Navy, and that was a key component in Japanese actions and failures. After that, of course, the Yorktown, which was supposed to take weeks to repair after the Battle of Corsi, but was at sea again in 48 hours, which elbowed the victory at Midway. Other small details here, planes crashing on landing, that happened frequently. Oh, and also note the correct helmets and rifles for the time at Midway. The movie took a moment to show the submarine which intercepted the Kido Butai fleet and led to a destroyer to be left behind to deal with it, which was a key detail in the battle. A very important factor in the movie was Admiral Nagumo's decision at Midway to rearm several times his planes as he learned of new developments. McCluskey attacking the wrong carrier, that happened, and Best with two others had to separate and attack the other carrier. Picking up the pieces on the carrier deck, they still do that today, so that's a nice detail. Oh, and a detail I'm very glad they added too, is Prunz choosing not to pursue. After his victory, he could easily have chosen to pursue Nagumo during the night, which all they probably would have done, but they preferred not to do it. Immediately after that, he was blamed for missing a bigger victory, but even showed he was right. Japanese still had an impressive surface fleet that was superior to the Americans in night fighting, and Nagumo prepared to ambush Prunz to even things up. So very glad they showed that here, with Osage Chief of Staff Browning disagreeing.
But their fleet might be out of range in the morning.
Nimitz ordered us to be judicious. We won a great victory today. Let's not blow it.
Of course, the movie had inaccuracies, but there are often small details like, oh, the uniforms are wrinkled, or some scenario choices to simplify the story. For example, the term was adopted after the war. The Japanese planes attacking at Pearl Harbor are way too low and are attacking from the wrong angle. Ships in wide shot scenes are often too close, but that's probably to show their numbers on screen. Of course, you had some other small details like which torpedo plane squadron attacked which ship, the Nautilus submarine firing at the carrier instead of the cruiser. Oh, and this actually made people react and say the movie wasn't realistic, because actually the TVD Devastator didn't carry bombs along with his torpedo, so not a good movie. Bruno Gaido and his pilot were not given cigarettes, and the occasion to give a terrible line.
You know, I had a lot of friends at Pearl Harbor, so how about you go fuck yourself?
But were badly beaten before being thrown overboard. And you had some scenario choices like not featuring Wildcat fighter planes, not featuring Admiral Fletcher, who was an overall command over Spruance at the time, but I'll come back on this later. The acting was also a controversial point, but I find the actors did a good job with what they had. Personally, I didn't like Ed Skrine's performance as Dick Best. He did a correct job overall, but his mannerisms, I don't know. Stay with me, Murray! And some complain that his Jersey accent sounded fake. Well, English is not my first language, so I cannot tell. Patrick Olson did a good job as Layton, as did Luke Evans as McCluskey. But the highlight performances of the movie, I think, were Woody Harrelson and Dennis Quaid as Nimitz and Halsey. You know, when a movie features big name actors, we tend to forget the characters a bit and refer to them as, say, Brad Pitt's character. But here, no. I know Woody from some other movies, but all I saw here was Admiral Nimitz. I'm no expert on Nimitz, I have yet to read his biography, but from what I know, he's well portrayed. think Quaid did a great job too as Halsey, who was more of a rough, aggressive, table-pounding and bellowing sailor. I love this scene here as we see the contrast between the two men.
Been out 6 months without a break.
There's a big difference between tired and whatever the hell you are. You're going ashore to the hospital.
Does this look like a battle wound to you? It's a damn rash. Now what are my men gonna think?
Oh, and also note that the two actors were the same age as the real Nimitz and Halsey at the time, 57 and 64 years old. So the acting overall was good, even if I liked less crying in this, but he did an okay job. And the Japanese parts were well acted also, especially the actor portraying Nagumo I found. Ah, now there's another tricky one. The main talking point of course is the CGI. Some people hated it, some loved it, some said it was okay. But let's be clear, CGI is never as good looking and convincing as the real thing when you can do it with practical effects. There are many cases in the movie where it felt a little off, like during the attack on Pearl or fire in the explosions. But overall, the CG was pretty good. Again, I'm all against using it when you can do it with practical effects. We have lots of examples, like Lord of the Rings vs. The Hobbit or Star Wars Special Editions. But in this case, Emmerich needed the CGI to portray the battle. I love Dunkirk by Christopher Nolan, and every scene looked extremely real, but it often felt diminutive because you could only show a couple of men at the time, a couple of ships at the time, and a couple of planes at the time. Here you had to portray hundreds of planes, dozens of ships, and since they don't exist anymore or were modified, Emmerich had to use computer effects. And most of the time it worked. The ships were beautiful and accurate with real attention to detail, mostly in wide ocean shots with the lighting differing with the weather in places. And in this case, it's really hard to be that good with real effects. But the real highlight of the movie in terms of effects was the dive bombing scene. Those are some of the best plane scenes I've ever seen. A ridiculous amount of details. Interesting fact, for the movie they built complete exact replicas of an SBD Dauntless and a TBD Devastator, down to every screw, as well as a replica of the deck of the Enterprise carrier.
Built the pilot ready room, the officers' quarters, the crew quarters, the mess hall.
There was maps on the walls and there was images of the planes that we were looking for.
Otherwise, in terms of production, you also had music. I don't have much to say, it was pretty decent. In this part, it reminded me a bit of the Dunkirk soundtrack, which was often more noise than music and built to generate more tension. Of course, perhaps the most contentious point in the movie is the scenario, the way it was structured and the characters. The scenario is pretty complex and simple at the same time. It's pretty much this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and so forth, with tons of historical characters who didn't and couldn't get much development. So, you guess that history fans like this, but many movie critics don't. Midway features the American side as well as the Japanese. For the Americans, the main characters are the pilots Best and McCluskey, the intelligence officers Layton and Rochford, and as commanders of course Nimitz and Halsey, who is leaders succeeded by Spruance for the battle. Then the Japanese scenes of course feature mainly the admirals Yamamoto, Nagumo, and Yamaguchi. Then you have a whole lot of characters featured for a little time and were part of history as well. But this is the part that received a lot of criticism and could be a real problem. Well, too many characters in subplots with no real consequence. Like Doolittle in his raid, he completely disappears, the submarine guys, Bruno Gaido, and so forth. But I can't help but sympathize with Took, who really wanted to portray all those characters and stories which were part of the events and were each worth screen time. And at the same time I understand why many people didn't like it. History is full of small contributions, but moviegoers and critics, especially today, they put a lot of focus on character development and growth. One thing that ticked me a bit but I found justifiable is Emmerich's specialty, the big amount of exposition. When you can't put everything on screen but you want to make sure that viewers unfamiliar with the details of the story understand it, often you make your characters explain it. But still, it always bothers me a bit when I watch it because the dialogue often doesn't feel natural. Like Nimitz would never have to explain basic things that were already understood by all,
You want us to contact Admiral Spruance?
No, he can't break radio silence.
Or this.
Look, I think we found the spot.
Can't say, Mr. Ford, that I've ever helped a big-time Hollywood director scout for a movie before. What kind of film are you planning to make in a godforsaken place like this?
They drove all this way without talking? Then again, it is understandable, and it's done in a much better way than Emmerich's other movies.
Considering he died during a test flight, how do you feel taking off for the moon from a hangar named after your father?
Midway focuses on aircraft carriers and bomber pilots, mainly the USS Enterprise and its air group, and that explains a lot of things in the scenario. The first scene of the film features a discussion between Layton and Yamamoto years before the war as a nice little introduction, and the second scene, even before Pearl Harbor, features the Enterprise. We're introduced to our main character, Dick Best, who's well, he's I
am dangerous.
He's a maverick. He's the hotshot pilot who gets things done and defies authority with his unorthodox methods. Now, I don't know if the real Best was like that, but personally, I'm not really a fan of him in the movie. Best has a difficult relationship with his fellow pilot Wayne McCluskey, who is much more responsible and professional. The movie was criticized for its many one-liners, and there are many. But to be honest, when you look at actual dialogue from the time and transcriptions from pilot communications, they tended to speak like that often. So back to the movie, we're then served with a short Pearl Harbor sequence with some of the worst CGI in the movie, but I found the crossing between the ships pretty tense. The movie immediately comes back to the Enterprise with Halsey's counterattack attempt, and coming back to a horrible sight with a nice detail.
When she went over, everyone below deck was probably trapped inside.
Best finds his friend's charred remains, pretty gruesome, and gives him an homage. Meanwhile, right after their success, the Japanese Navy and Army are still fighting for preponderance. In Washington, Nimitz is called to command the Pacific Fleet.
I don't envy the new commander. It's me, isn't it?
And upon his arrival at Pearl, he meets with Layton. He soon realizes the importance of code breaking. He then orders a carrier raid on the Marshall Islands with Halsey's Enterprise and Fletcher's Yorktown, which we don't see in this scene and not much in the movie, again because of the focus on the first ship. The Kara group comes back to base and Best and McCluskey go to a local dance event, which gives us one of my favorite moments from McCluskey.
Every time we go up in one of those planes, there's a chance we won't come back. Now it's hard to follow a man who doesn't know that, or even worse, doesn't care.
The Enterprise and its men are then sent to escort another carrier, the Hornet, for the Doolittle raid. Doolittle and his men bomb Tokyo and then must ditch over China. He's then held by anti-Japanese Chinese forces, and we don't hear from him again. This was a criticism point for the movie, and I agree we kinda want to see more, but the focus remains on aircraft carriers the whole time, and this subplot links up with an important Japanese decision. Yamamoto sets to destroy America's remaining carriers in battle. The battle of Coral Sea is the first among them, and was very important, but we don't see it happening because the Enterprise arrives too late to participate. Meanwhile, as the Japanese plan for the upcoming operation at Midway and believe they will ambush the Americans, Nimitz and his codebreakers manage to find out where the Japanese attack will be. Halsey is too sick to participate in the upcoming battle and is replaced by Spruance. Again, I love this scene with Quaid and Harrison. Meanwhile, Best receives new leadership responsibilities, but tastes his failure and feels guilty when a young pilot dies. Each side prepares for battle, and in the morning, the Japanese attack. Spruance's carriers, however, ambush them and throw torpedo planes and dive bombers at Nagumo's fleet. From now on, we're treated with one hell of a bombing sequence. In some beautiful and thrilling sequences, the Americans manage to bomb 3 Japanese carriers. One interesting element is that it features several bombing runs with lots of tension and anticipation, but that end up missing the target, notably McCluskey's run. Despite enormous losses, US pilots must launch again to finish off the 4th carrier, which Best bombs.
This is for Pearl.
You know, it sounds cheesy, but honestly, it must have been said by a pilot at one point. Of course, he then disappears in the explosion, and we're left to wonder if he will come back. Well, of course he does, because he's Maverick, the real best did it. No, seriously, this fake tension was just cheesy and unnecessary. Having to land without gas after 2 bombing runs was enough. Upon their return, Best and McCluskey finally get along better. Thereafter, the Japanese must abandon their last carrier, and Admiral Yamaguchi chooses to go down with it. Each side reacts to the conclusion of the events, and we're given Gettysburg-like credits that show the fate of each major character. So there you have it. As much as I fear Midway would be another Pearl Harbor, a long, cliché, artificial love triangle interrupted by the Japanese, it was none of that. Sure, the scenario was a bit jerky at times, but it had a clear and coherent focus throughout the entirety of the film. It was the importance of the aircraft carriers that were the objective of the battle for both sides, mainly those of the Kido Butai for the Japanese and the Enterprise and its air group for the Americans, with characters chosen to represent each side and each part of the events as they unfolded. Sure, I made some references to Top Gun, but thankfully we didn't get the America celebrations when the pilot came back. Or during the dogfights.
Got you, son of a bitch! Let's play some chicken with these Jap suckers! Yeah, I got one!
Instead, we're given a tense, visually pleasant, and simplified version of the battle. As I said, there were a lot of complaints for the lack of character developments, but that's just not the point of the movie. People complain for this about Dunkirk too, but Dunkirk was a film that puts you in the shoes of the average soldier trying to escape the beach. Midway wants to show events through many characters that each had a part in them. The movie was considered a flop mainly because people didn't like the format. That is, lots of characters with historical exposition and each having their limited part in the story made of short scenes. In that way, Midway reminds me a lot of beloved war movie classics such as The Longest Day, A Bridge Too Far, or even more relevant, Tora Tora Tora. These were all classics that still hold very well today, yet I think they each feel a little bit better than Midway. This could be for several reasons, like characters well introduced to distinguish them so we could connect more, and more fluid pacing. Still, Midway feels like this kind of old-fashioned movie, and that does not fit well with today's trends. Maybe with hindsight its reputation will change. So after all this, let's take a look at the critics on Rotten Tomatoes.
You stupid son of a bitch!
What he said. Midway portrays well the different historical figures involved and contains in 2 hours and 18 minutes more than we can imagine. The simple-minded, label-making reviews I've read are the one with no substance, not the movie.
Just all labels. You just label everything. That's so fucking lazy. It's just a bunch of crappy opinions backed up by even crappier comparison.
Many of them sneer at the bravery depicted, but the history enthusiasts who respect it and won't forget it will surely appreciate this portrayal. The movie is paced really fast though, so for those who can situate the succession of events, it can be a little confusing. But if you want a good, yet not perfect, movie about the battle in Midway and the events leading up to it, go and watch Roland Emmerich's Midway.
They see me rolling, they hating, they riding, trying to criticize me dirty, trying to criticize me dirty, trying to criticize me dirty.